BLUESTREAK is mostly known for one main characteristic. He's a blabbermouth. He never stops talking. He talks and talks over anything and everything under the sun. Most dismiss him as a fool who just doesn't know when to shut up, or someone who is just enamored by the sound of his own voice. But for his comrades who know him better, they know that his constant prattling is his way of dealing with the deeper pain of loss that he experienced in the past. He is haunted by the memories of the Decepticons destroying his home city of Praxus on Cybertron at the start of the Great War. In the Dreamwave Comics continuity, it is even established that BLUESTREAK, as the sole survivor of said destruction, was not due to anything he did, or by chance. His survival was a deliberate act by Megatron, who wanted someone to witness the destructive powers of the Decepticon forces and spread his message of terror to the rest of the planet. His fellow Autobot hound says it best. There's some demons running loose inside that boy, and sometimes I think they grab hold of him and won't let him go. Talk is cheap, but it keeps him sane. So sometime in the 80s, my dad was constantly going on international business trips. Even if that meant that I wouldn't see him for weeks at a time, I wasn't particularly bothered by it, especially since that when he would come home, he'd always come home bearing gifts. Anyway, on a particular trip to the US, I had only one thing in my wish list: Transformers, which at the time were the new toys that all the kids were talking about. Even though I already had a few Diaclone robots, as far as I was concerned, they just weren't the real deal. Once I saw the Transformers cartoon, all I wanted were the official toys, and on his return, my dad definitely delivered in spades. As the familiar saying goes, you never forget your first, and when it comes to Transformers, my firsts were definitely very memorable indeed. My dad brought home 3 shiny new robots from that trip. The first one was the evil Decepticon leader himself, Megatron. The second one was even more mind-blowing since it was a brand new character that I had never heard of up until that point, the Autobot Air Guardian, Jetfire. And the third one was BLUESTREAK. Now, BLUESTREAK was one of the original 11 Autobot deluxe car robots released during the first year of the toy line. Being one of the 11 already put BLUESTREAK at a disadvantage for standing out from the rest. To add to his troubles, he wasn't even unique as he shared the same toy mold with another original 11 character, Prowl, who sported an arguably flashier police car design. Don't get me wrong though, at that point I was happy to get any Transformer toy, but standing next to Megatron and Jetfire, it was a little harder to get just as excited over BLUESTREAK. He seemed more like a bonus throw-in, the icing on the cake. In the original cartoon, I would say that BLUESTREAK fell somewhere in the lower half of the character totem pole. While he definitely wasn't as heavily featured as, let's say, Jazz or Ironhide, I think he did a little better than Trailbreaker or Windcharger. To be fair though, the writers had to introduce 20 plus new characters over the course of the first season, so it was inevitable that only a few major personalities would emerge, while others would simply be relegated to one-off scenes and eventually just background characters. Possibly his most prominently featured role was in the late Season 2 episode, Trans-Europe Express, where a good number of Autobot cars, including a few Season 1 characters like Wheeljack, Sunstreaker, and Sideswipe, also made surprise appearances as well. Unfortunately, most of them were basically brought back to be cannon fodder for the Stunticons. But not BLUESTREAK. Aside from successfully avoiding a Stunticon beatdown, BLUESTREAK actually ends up winning the race, making it all the way to the third act where he, along with Trax and surprise surprise, Bumblebee, successfully saved the day from Menasor and Megatron. One thing worth mentioning though was that BLUESTREAK was voiced by the legendary Casey Kasem. Unfortunately, even that bright spot on BLUESTREAK's resume would turn sour when Mr. Kasem would suddenly leave the cartoon over some negative racial issues, which in turn probably sped up BLUESTREAK's inevitable retirement from the series. On the bright side though, his disappearance is definitely a better fate than what was handed to his moldmate, Prowl. In any case, despite being one of the least featured characters of the original Autobots across most Transformers media, it's BLUESTREAK's origin and toy that has gotten him the most attention from fans throughout the years. As confusing as it may be, the creation of his character and the production of his toy has, in my opinion, quite an interesting story. So when looking at his original toy released in 1984, any keen-eyed observer would see that despite being called BLUESTREAK, his original toy is predominantly silver with some red and black accents, with hardly any hints of blue at all. Adding to the confusion though was that all accompanying artwork and pictures in the box and instructions showed a definitely blue Transformer. So what gives? Well, the story starts in Japan with the pre-Transformers line from Takara, Diaclone. Now, given the premise that these pre-Transformers weren't sentient beings and basically machines that were piloted by humans, as a way I guess to maximize production costs, it was a pretty common practice for each toy design to be sold in multiple colors. And BLUESTREAK was no exception. The original Diaclone Fairlady Z toy that would eventually become BLUESTREAK was released in the aforementioned blue color, as well as in silver, with a black hood and roof section, which we'll get to later on. Anyway, it was the blue version of the toy that made its way to the US into the hands of the people at Hasbro, who made the Transformers toys, and Marvel, who made the accompanying comic book. It was then Marvel comic book writer Bob Budiansky who saw said blue car robot and decided to naturally call it BLUESTREAK. He then proceeded to give him the characteristic of being a motor mouth, which would further match his name as a double pun that was a reference to the phrase to talk a blue streak, an American English idiom that means talking a lot. With all that established though, somewhere towards the latter part of the toys production, with artwork and promotional toy photography already shot, someone at Hasbro inexplicably made the call to do a last-minute switch up to the toy BLUESTREAK's color into the predominantly silver one that eventually made it into retail stores, which ultimately led to the myth of the original blue BLUESTREAK. Back then, many assumed that the silver BLUESTREAK that kids got was actually a later-running production change, and that a few original blues are still out there somewhere costing a fortune. The truth though is that Hasbro never released one, and the blue toy in the instructions and catalog were really just the old Diaclone version of the toy. And even the blue BLUESTREAK artwork on the box was directly lifted off the original Diaclone packaging. But it doesn't stop there. Remember that second Diaclone color variation? In what can only be explained as the toy gods effing around, that color palette was used as the basis for BLUESTREAK's animation model for the original cartoon series, as well as his look in the Marvel comics. So, not only did you have a silver BLUESTREAK toy that didn't look like the artwork it came with, he even looked different from the cartoon and comics. Poor guy. Anyway, as if the different color decos weren't confusing enough, things got even messier when multiple names came into the picture. First in 2002, when Takara would do a reissue of the original toy, but this time based on the animation-accurate silver and black deco, and under the Japanese name of BLUESTREAK, where he was simply known as Streak. Then in 2003, when Hasbro produced another vintage toy reissue, this time based on their original silver deco, as a Toys R Us exclusive. At this point, Hasbro had actually lost the rights to the name BLUESTREAK to another toy company. So I guess, given no choice, they took this opportunity to logically rename him as SILVERSTREAK, which to be fair, made more sense. Then came the Alternators toy line in the US, where SILVERSTREAK was one of the very first releases. As per his name, he was now a silver street model Subaru Impreza. And just to keep things interesting, the Japanese version of this line called Vinyltech released the same toy with more die-cast under their name of Streak, and then a blue version years later called, well, BLUESTREAK. But back in the US, where they still didn't own the trademark of BLUESTREAK, SILVERSTREAK remained the norm, as with one of his more popular toy releases in the 2008 Classics line. Interestingly though, at this point, Hasbro had mostly ditched the completely silver deco for the animation-accurate silver and black, which, to be fair, is how I always saw him. Sue me, I'm a toon guy. Frenzy is red, and Rumble is blue. Anyway, finally in 2009, Hasbro regained the trademark rights to the name of BLUESTREAK, and everything was right in the world again. I mean, while SILVERSTREAK was more accurate to his deco, it just didn't have the same ring to it as BLUESTREAK, in my opinion. But just when you thought that things were finally back to normal as possible, enter Takara to keep the confusion going with the ultimate version of BLUESTREAK for their masterpiece line in 2013, sporting his black and silver deco and unsurprisingly called Streak, which to be fair they had been pretty consistent with. But then the following year, they released a silver version called, well, SILVERSTREAK, and then the year after that, a blue one called BLUESTREAK. Now I know that they were just trying to cover all their bases and satisfy as many fans out there who were particular to specific decos. But come on! Really? To their credit though, Hasbro has since stuck to their guns and remained pretty consistent on this one with their MP release as well as later toys sporting the animation colors and the name BLUESTREAK. Aside from the Masterpiece version, we got the Siege, War for Cybertron, and Earthrise BLUESTREAKs, both decoed in black and silver. And that honestly should have been the end of it. Except, of course it wasn't. Just to make sure us fans wouldn't get too comfortable, in 2022, the blue decoed BLUESTREAK made a surprising return to US retail. Except, he wasn't called BLUESTREAK. Silver Streak was released in the buzzworthy Bumblebee line as a recolor of the Earthrise Smokescreen toy, sporting the classic blue Diaclone deco. Oh well. So now I guess the best way to spin this is that despite their shared history, it appears that Hasbro is making an honest attempt into making Silver Streak his own thing, his own unique character, that in turn would be another toy for completists like myself to buy. You know how it goes, easy repaint, easy money. And so with the silver and black deco as BLUESTREAK, and the blue deco as Silver Streak, where does that leave the predominantly silver deco of the original toy? Well, that version has seemingly and thankfully gone the way of the dodo. But if for some insane reason either Hasbro or Takara decide to bring that back, oh what the hell, let's just call that one Streak. Anyway, I think I've talked enough about the Autobot motor mouth who could essentially talk up a BLUESTREAK. Despite the very confusing story behind his toys and the fact that he was more of a periphery character at best in the cartoon and comics, and he was basically outshined by both Megatron and Jetfire, BLUESTREAK was still one of my very first Transformer toys, and for that reason alone, he will always have a special place in my collection. Do you believe in second chances? Well, as a kid, one of my very first Transformer toys was the silver Autobot, BLUESTREAK. I got him from my dad who came home from a business trip from the US bearing gifts. In possibly one of the greatest hauls he ever got for me, I received the Decepticon leader Megatron, the Autobot Air Guardian Jetfire, and BLUESTREAK. And given the epicness of receiving Megs and Jetfire in one fell swoop, I'm sure you can understand how a minor character like BLUESTREAK could be lost in all the excitement. Still, I did like my BLUESTREAK toy quite a lot and played with him so much so that he eventually lost his luster and his poorly designed windshield unfortunately and inevitably broke off. And it wasn't long before my poor BLUESTREAK was soon lost in the endless sea of time. Okay, so that's a bit dramatic. He basically disappeared into the depths of my toy room. Anyway, fast forward a year later, and instead of waiting for my dad to return home from another business trip, there I was, alongside him on a US vacation, walking down the hollowed halls of Toys R Us for the first time. And that's when this guy immediately caught my attention. Smokescreen wasn't just a straight-up repaint of BLUESTREAK. He was a more colorful and cooler looking version of BLUESTREAK. I'm not sure if you can recall, but I remember being especially attracted to his box art, which featured Smokescreen in a more dynamic lunging pose as opposed to his two previous Datsun bros, who stoically stood back. But all that aside, the main thought running through my 9-year-old brain was, yes, I get another chance to have a better BLUESTREAK toy. And that was my first experience with the Autobot diversionary tactician, Smokescreen. To be honest, as a kid, the words diversionary tactician basically flew over my head. All I cared about was that this was my second shot at the Datsun mold toy, and I just couldn't get over how his red, white, and blue race car deco looked so much more awesome. I felt like I hit the jackpot with this guy. So Smokescreen was part of the second wave of Autobot cars released in 1985, alongside fellow repaint/retools of previous Autobots, Hoist and Red Alert, as well as newer designs like Trax, Inferno, Grapple, and Skids. And of all of them, aside from the fact that he was the only toy that I had from the bunch, Smokescreen was my definite favorite. Anyway, given that the main goal of the cartoon and the comics was to sell more toys, it's no surprise that there really wasn't too much effort given in coming up with proper introductions or much less explanations on how these new characters came to be. In the cartoon, Smokescreen and company just magically appeared in the second season of the series, as if they were there from the very start. At least in the comics, Smokescreen's addition is somewhat explained in that prior to the Autobots' exodus to Earth, he and his fellow second wavers agreed to have their minds encoded on crystalline containment vessels. Left in storage for millions of years after the crash, the new Autobots were eventually reactivated inside newly constructed bodies when reinforcements were needed. To their credit, due to the fact that Smokescreen was basically a repaint of BLUESTREAK and PROWL, the artists for the cartoon and comics did make an effort to visually differentiate him from his two brothers. Unfortunately, what they came up with as a final design was kinda disappointing. Unlike BLUESTREAK and PROWL's designs, which were more stylized and, well, better proportioned, Smokescreen's appearance was definitely more simplified, to look more like a direct translation from the toy. He was stockier and blockier, especially when it came to his head sculpt, which now sported a really ugly rectangular design which made him look, for lack of a better word, necklace. And add to that a pair of equally angular shoulder cannons on each side, and you've got one really ugly Autobot. Talk about sucking all the cool out of a character. Anyway, while for the most part Smokescreen wasn't much of a major player in both the original comics and cartoons, he did manage to star in his own special episode of the cartoon called The Gambler. The episode starts off with Optimus Prime and a bunch of Autobots, including Smokescreen, getting captured in space by an alien named Bosch, who immobilizes the Autobots with the intention of selling them off as slaves. Very early on, Smokescreen notices that Bosch is addicted to gambling, as he shows off his very own personal slot machine which he apparently can't win at. Sensing an opportunity, Smokescreen shows off his ability to manipulate machinery with the use of a not-so-subtle cable from his wrist, and beats Bosch's machine. Impressed, Bosch strikes up a partnership with Smokescreen, and the two head off to the gambling planet of Monacus, where they win big. Unfortunately, Smokescreen gets caught up in all the excitement and basically bets all their winnings on one high-stakes gamble. That doesn't pay off. His little advantage is discovered and deactivated, and the duo lose all their winnings, which include Prime and company, who were used as collateral to a local swindler named Gaikoni. So as the story goes, the Decepticons Astrotrain, Ramjet, and Dirge show up to shake down Gaikoni. The Autobots end up in a gladiatorial pit to battle some animalians, and Smokescreen meets up with an Autobot bounty hunter named Devcon, and eventually saves the day and rescues everyone by using his other special ability, filling up the entire gladiatorial arena in smoke. In the end, the Decepticons flee, Devcon goes off on his next adventure, and Smokescreen and company return to Earth. But not before going off back to Casino Row with their now new buddy Bosch for a little more rest and relaxation. Entertaining story aside, there was another interesting tidbit I realized after rewatching this episode. So, Smokescreen was voiced by the voice actor Jack Angel, voice of the G.I. Joe SEAL wetsuit as well. He was also the voice of both Ramjet and Astrotrain. I also thought that the alien Bosch and Devcon sounded familiar, in a Cuppy sort of way, and apparently both Alien and Bounty Hunter were voiced by John Stephenson, the man behind the Autobot veteran, Cup. So I just found it quite funny how back in the day they must have selected the characters that would appear in any given episode in line with maximizing the schedules of the voice actors. Anyway, this episode also gave us a glimpse of the intended personality of Smokescreen as written on his original tech spec. Unlike the overly talkative BLUESTREAK or the cold, overly logical Prowl, Smokescreen sets himself apart with his unique charm and overall likability. But that is only half the story when it comes to Smokescreen. True to his diversionary tactician role, this affable side to his personality has its ulterior side as well, as it allows him to gain the trust of his fellow Autobots, and then reports back to Optimus Prime, giving his leader an on-the-ground perspective on what his troops are thinking. On the battlefield, Smokescreen's main objective is to lead the enemy astray, and is not above resorting to dishonest methods like flat-out lying, cheating, or stealing to get her done. Of course, it helps immensely that he has that aforementioned ability to emit a magnetic cloud of smoke which sounds both cool and awful at the same time, straight from his tailpipes to engulf Decepticons in polluted darkness. And if that wasn't bad enough, he can also zap them with his electro-disruptor rifle for even more fun-filled confusion. So yeah, as a character, I think that there was quite a lot of storytelling potential with Smokescreen, but unfortunately for the most part, he was basically relegated to a second-tier character in most Transformers media. Anyway, before we go any further, I hope you don't mind my ulterior motives in me asking you for help for my channel by leaving a like, a comment, or even a sub if you still haven't. I hope you know that I'm not just blowing smoke up your bums when I say how important your viewership and support is to me. Hearing from all of you is what really inspires me to continue telling these stories, and I am forever appreciative. So, thank you. And now back to the story. Now, despite being pretty much a totally different character, it would be a huge disservice to not mention the version of Smokescreen that was part of the 2010 series Transformers Prime. I guess you could call this Smokescreen more of an homage to the G1 character, as he had specific callbacks like his red, white, and blue race car deco, although this time predominantly white, as well as the race number 38 on his side. But that's pretty much where the similarities end, as this Smokescreen isn't as devious as his G1 counterpart, although you could say that he does have some charm. Actually, the personality of this Smokescreen reminded me more of another popular, overeager young Autobot with some iconic flames emblazoned on his chest. Well, you know what they say, where there's smoke, there's fire. Anyway, this Smokescreen is best characterized as an eager, young soldier boy who spent most of his time on Cybertron and who, despite undergoing training as an elite guard, was assigned as a security detail at the Iacon Hall of Records guarding Alpha Trion and the relics in the vault. And speaking of relics, Smokescreen comes into the possession of one called a phase shifter, which allows him the ability to pass through solid objects, sort of like turning him into Kitty Pryde of the X-Men. The phase shifter basically turns into his signature weapon. Eventually, Smokescreen is captured by the Decepticons, is placed on a transport ship, but thankfully escapes and finds his way to Earth in order to join up with Prime and company to start off the second season of the show. Originally though, Smokescreen was intended to join the team much earlier on. In fact, he was supposed to be part of the original cast of Autobots and was meant to be killed off in the Season 1 finale. But ultimately, plans changed and the poor Autobot Cliffjumper took his place as the Autobot who died, only this time in the first episode instead. Ironically, this wasn't the first time Smokescreen cheated death, as the original character was supposed to be killed off in the 1986 movie as well. Early storyboards showed a dead Smokescreen laying on the ground, most likely squashed by Devastator, but once again, fortunately for him, he was switched out for Wheeljack in the final cut. But back to this Smokescreen, who was apparently meant for bigger things, or at least that's what we were meant to believe, as he actually comes so close to inheriting the matrix of leadership from a near-death Optimus Prime. I mean, at the time, I actually thought they would do it, given how Smokescreen spoke in a French accent like the Autobot Hot Rod. Just kidding. Given how this Smokescreen was so similar to G1 Hot Rod, who did acquire the Matrix and turn into Rodimus Prime, I genuinely thought that we would be getting Smokimus Prime. Doesn't have quite the ring, does it? Well, turned out to be one big fake out and Smokescreen ended up saving Prime and all was well. He may have not become the new Autobot leader, but he did get a spanking new predominantly blue deco to start off the next season, and the claim to fame that he was almost a Prime. Anyway, I don't know if it was due to the original plan of Smokescreen getting killed off, but initially it didn't seem like there was any intention to make a proper Smokescreen toy, as the first one we got basically seemed like a rushed out and forced repaint/retool of the Decepticon Knockout, given to us surprisingly by Takara, who is usually known for being sticklers for accuracy. Thankfully, this time around, Hasbro would eventually release a uniquely designed and engineered Smokescreen toy as part of their Beast Hunter subline. Sure, he came with some unnecessary plastic add-on parts to make his car mode look more beastly, but you could easily just leave them off. They then took and retooled and recolored that mold into Prowl. And speaking of recolors, here's a Legion class version of this Smokescreen in G1 colors. Now, since we've moved on to the toys, let's keep going. Smokescreen also has the distinct honor of being the first character to be released in the 2003 alternators and the 2004 Japanese version Binaltech toy lines. These lines featured updated versions of G1 Autobots with officially licensed alt modes, with full interiors and detailing, obviously meant for older toy collectors and car enthusiasts in mind. And while I can't say that I'm big into cars, I was into toys, and this specific line served as my entryway back into collecting toys as an adult. And so the story goes, despite not sharing the same deco as the original Smokescreen, this guy is meant to be the OG character who suffered from a bad case of cosmic rust set loose by the Decepticons. But thanks to the Earth Defense Command and their BinalTech project, Smokescreen is the first Autobot to undergo transference into an electrocell-powered new body, which of course means a new alt mode. No longer a Datsun 280ZX Turbo based on the electromotive touring car driven by Don Devendorf, BinalTech Smokescreen is now a blue 2003 Subaru Impreza WRC rally car coming with 2 number designations connected with this specific car. The number 7 for the driver Peter Solberg and co-driver Phil Mills, and the number 8 for Tommy Mäkinen and Kaz Lindstrom. He also came in American alternators plastic and Japanese BinalTech die-cast metal. This new Smokescreen was most likely what served as inspiration for Prime Smokescreen's new blue deco, and was such a big deal back in the day that Subaru actually made a life-sized model prop of the BinalTech Smokescreen using body shell parts of the actual car for some corporate event that could actually transform. Anyway, even if the original Smokescreen character wasn't featured much, the fact that he was basically a simple repaint / retool of his more popular Datsun Brothers Prowl and BLUESTREAK meant that we were never left wanting for any new toys of Smokescreen. Starting with my first G1 Smokescreen toy since the original, which was released in 2009 as part of Japan's Henkei Henkei, or Transform line. Actually, this same toy was released a year prior by Hasbro for their Universe line. I opted to wait a little bit longer for the more superior decoed Japanese version. A Smokescreen toy was also released to beef up the 2009 live-action movie Revenge of the Fallen toy line, but given that there were no Prowl or BLUESTREAK characters in the previous movie, Hasbro opted to just repaint an existing deluxe Jazz toy blue and red and call him Smokescreen. And while this guy never made it to the big screen, I believe he was featured in some comics in between the movies. Although, the most memorable role he played was to be fodder for a menacing Shockwave to basically slaughter. Then in 2013, after the releases of Masterpiece Prowl and BLUESTREAK, we finally got the inevitable Masterpiece Smokescreen. And while I guess you could give Takara points for going the extra mile for the uniquely tooled head and shoulder rockets, it's just plain unfortunate that they were based off the super blocky cartoon design, which I guess by this point was to be expected. Years later, they even managed to release a Plus version, which was even closer to the cartoon model with even less detailing and an even more blockier head sculpt. But despite coming with some sculpted smoke accessories, I decided to pass on this version. At this point, with every new Datsun release, it's basically a given that a red, white, and blue Smokescreen would see the light of day. In the 2014 Combiner Wars toy line, the Protectobot Streetwise was recolored into Prowl, which was then eventually repainted into Smokescreen, with a blue BLUESTREAK released as a special subscription exclusive as well. And finally, in 2019 and 2020, the 2 latest versions of Smokescreen were released. First was a Cybertronian mode from the War of Cybertron Siege line, and secondly, the Earth version from Earthrise. But hey, I'm definitely not complaining at all. The more Smokescreens, the better in my opinion. Hasbro definitely loves their Datsuns. In fact, Hasbro apparently loves Datsun so much that they even brought in a new brother into the family with the evil Decepticon Barricade, who in actuality is more of a straight-up repaint of Smokescreen than his 2 other bros. Yup, same blockhead design. When it comes to the live-action Transformers movies, I think that it's safe to say that there is a lot to hate about them. Granted, they never presented themselves as prime examples of sophisticated cinema. I think many fans are in the same boat, thinking that there was so much more that could have been done to make them not as bad as they ultimately turned out. Still, I do think that despite all the bad, Michael Bay and company did have some good to great additions to the Transformers mythos as a whole. It's a pretty popular opinion by many fans that while Bay isn't the greatest storyteller, he does excel in making explosive set pieces and memorable action scenes. And as such, while a lot of our favorite classic Autobots and Decepticons ended up more as glorified alt-mode commercials with close to 0 personalities, I do think that we did get some cool new characters linked to some very memorable moments. Looking at the first movie alone, we got all new Decepticons like Blackout laying waste to a US military base. And who can forget the menacing Bone Crushers skating down the highway and smashing through a bus? And of course, we got the evil police car Barricade, cruelly intimidating a hysterically confused Sam Witwicky in an awesome Ford Mustang police car mode, aggressively revving his engine and bearing his intimidatingly spiky probes at the poor human, before he finally transforms and reveals himself as the evil Decepticon. Chasing and finally pinning down poor Sam, Barricade utters his famous iconic line, the first words we ever hear come out from a live-action Transformer's mouth.
Are you username LadiesMan217?
Yeah?
Where is the eBay item 21153? Where are the bosses?
Just perfect, if you ask me. And no, I'm not being sarcastic about this. Up to this point, at least I was kinda wondering exactly how the Transformers would be portrayed in live action. Not so much as how they moved around and transformed, but how they would speak and interact with each other and humans. Yes, we did hear the iconic Peter Cullen as Optimus Prime starting things off with a little voiceover at the very start. But I was more concerned about how the others, especially the Decepticons, would speak. And hearing Barricade sounding fairly normal gave me quite a relief moving forward. I just loved the threatening tone mixed in with a tinge of naivety at him not realizing the silliness of the words he was spouting. Nicely done, Mr. Bay. And speaking of Barricade's voice, at least for the first movie, all credit goes to the voice actor Jess Harnell, who on a side note fronts an awesome band called Rock Sugar that specializes in doing really cool mashups of popular rock songs. Ever wonder what Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody would sound like with a dash of Kickstart My Heart by Motley Crue? Or how about Metallica's Enter Sandman with Don't Stop Believing by Journey? Can't imagine? Well then go check Rock Sugar and their album Reimaginator out. So back to Barricade. After his cool introduction, unfortunately it was all downhill from there. Barricade basically lost all his coolness cred in my eyes when he got his ass handed to him by Bumblebee, and that would pretty much be it for him for the rest of the movie. After one more cameo during a highway chase scene towards the end of the movie, he seemingly disappears and is not heard of again. Which I guess was ultimately a good thing as all his fellow Decepticons pretty much bit the dust in the final battle. But for those who read the accompanying comic to the movie though, it did seem that the reason Barricade wasn't a part of the final battle was that because he was already dead, killed by Prime during the same highway chase scene that also led to Bone Crusher's demise. Fortunately, his death was retconned and Barricade made his triumphant return in the third movie, Dark of the Moon, wherein he mercilessly executes his prisoner, the poor Autobot Q. To be honest, prior to writing this episode, I had no idea that Barricade was actually in this movie. Okay, I knew that his model was used as one of the background Decepticons or something, but all this time I always thought that it was Soundwave who took out Q. I guess it was because he was voiced by Frank Welker, who also voiced Soundwave. And after a while, all those messy Bayverse designs just sort of blend into each other in my brain. Anyway, he's eventually taken down by the humans with a sniper shot to his eye and an explosive charge to the foot. But he still ultimately manages to survive again to return in the fifth movie, The Last Night. This time around, he comes in with an updated, more humanoid design and is seemingly now Megatron's new right-hand bot. Unfortunately for him, despite his new look and role, he really doesn't do anything significant and basically gets his ass kicked once again by Bumblebee and Grimlock. But oh well, at least he still managed to stay alive, so good for him. In Philippine folklore, we have something called an anting-anting, which is sort of a mystical talisman that people wear for protection, basically making them invincible. Given how many times Barricade escaped death, I wouldn't be surprised if he sported one. Anyway, now that we're basically done with Barricade's rather unimpressive movie resume, let's do a little dive into his origins, shall we? But before we go there, I hope you won't barricade me from asking you all to subscribe to my channel. It'll really help me out a lot in telling even more stories. And if you already have subscribed, well, thank you, and please do come back for more. So before the live-action movie, the name Barricade wasn't really connected to any major Decepticon or Autobot from the cartoon or comics. He did exist though as a tiny little Decepticon Micromaster. G1 Barricade was the abusive and authoritarian leader of the Decepticon Racetrack Patrol Team, which was composed of fellow racers Roller Force, Groundhog, and Motorhead. And that's pretty much all I have to say about that, as I was completely out of the Transformers and toys in general by the time these little guys rolled around. Also, in order to avoid Energon fans calling me out for ignoring them, I will note that the name Barricade was used again for the leader of the Destruction Team, 5 Decepticon military vehicles who combined to form the mighty Bruticus Maximus. And while I have absolutely no knowledge about this Barricade in the Energon cartoon, I do have some first-hand experience with these toys. As if the combined name didn't give it away, this set was meant to be an homage to the original G1 combiner, Bruticus. And when it was later recolored in a re-release, the likeness was close enough to the original Bruticus to convince me to purchase it when it went on clearance. Anyway, given the fact that the name Barricade was one of the more obscure Transformer names before the live-action movies, I guess the writers figured that using it for one of their newer characters would draw less ire from traditional and purist G1 fans like myself. So which new character got the name? Well, during the early planning stages of the movie, when Michael Bay and company were still figuring out which Transformers would make the cut, the Autobot military strategist Prowl was a strong candidate to be included. That is, until Bay figured that it would be more fun to have a Transformer that turned into a police car to be a Decepticon instead. And so Prowl was out, and the newly minted Barricade was in, with his perversion of the police slogan of "to protect and to serve," now reading as "to punish and enslave," proudly emblazoned on the side of his alt mode. You know, I often shit on Michael Bay for switching out tried and true traditional Transformer concepts for his own dumb ideas, like trading out the Lambo brothers for this set of twins. But I'll give him this. Barricade was a cool twist to the traditional but cliché good guy police car Transformer, and his predominantly black Ford Mustang car mode was just intimidatingly gorgeous. Unfortunately, I can't say that I was a huge fan of the actual Barricade robot design. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm okay with it, but given how cool his alt mode was, I expected a little more. I don't know, his uneven proportions with extra long arms, short legs, and lack of a defined mid-torso made him look almost simian in appearance. Add to that all the spikes and twisted metal, which I get was basically par for the course for most of the movie designs, made him remind me more of a goblin or something, rather than a ruthless armored enforcer. Overall though, I did love this bad cop change, but I was still hoping against hope that another twist was incoming, with Barricade actually being an Autobot double agent in the end, revealing himself to be Prowl all along. But that never really happened. Oh well, it would have been cool. It's also worth noting that before the writers settled on Barricade, another iconic Decepticon, Soundwave, was in the mix in early drafts, basically fulfilling the role that Barricade ended up doing in the final movie, i.e. scouring eBay for the item 21153 and eventually stalking and tracking down Ladies Man 217 himself. And even if Soundwave was eventually set aside for future movies, his presence is still felt as Barricade remains partnered with fellow little Decepticon, Frenzy, who is traditionally known as a minion of Soundwave and is colored red. As far as toys go, given that Barricade was part of the main Decepticon movie lineup, he was one of the first movie toys that I got. And even if it wasn't very accurate, his first deluxe-sized movie toy was always one of my favorites in the original toy line, especially since, to my knowledge, this and the later released larger Human Alliance version were the only Barricade toys that actually had a little crude Frenzy toy that could be folded up and stored inside his chest. Hell, even the supposedly more accurate Studio Series or Movie Masterpiece versions couldn't do that. And speaking of the Movie Masterpiece version, on a quick side story, I'd like to share that I actually ended up getting two of them. Sort of. See, I was kind of a late starter when it came to collecting Movie Masterpiece Transformers, and by the time I was all in, MPM-03 Bumblebee and the arguably improved knockoff version were nowhere to be found, at least at a decent secondary market price. And so given how impatient, impulsive, and desperate I was, such a deadly mix for any collector, I found an online seller with a fairly priced Bumblebee. The catch was that he was bundled up with a broken Barricade. Even if I already had a Masterpiece Barricade, I figured that this would be the best chance for me to get a Masterpiece B, and so I bit the bullet. I figured that I was such a big fan of Barricade's alt mode that it would be cool to have the broken one displayed as such. Of course, as what always seemed to be the case, only a few months after I got my B, MPM collectors all around the world decided to call it quits, and MPM Bs for sale suddenly started popping up everywhere. Ugh. What I am still holding out hope for though, although chances are pretty slim to none, is a good Masterpiece version of Barricade's upgraded look from the last night. While his original twisted metal and spiky look is more iconic, this is the look of Barricade that I love. Everything I wasn't a fan of with his original look are, in my opinion, rectified with this new version. I'm a big fan of this more streamlined and bulky Barricade. Unfortunately, by the time the last night rolled around, Hasbro wasn't even trying, as the toy line for this movie were mostly dumbed down glorified shell formers, including Barricade. While prototype pics of a potential third-party masterpiece Barricade surfaced online a few years back, it appears that that project is now dead in the water. So at this point, I'd be happy with just an improved Studio Series version that could then maybe be knocked off into an oversized version for my display. For now though, the oversized knockoff of the crappy retail version will have to do for my Megatron's crew. Since the movie, Barricade has sort of become a frequently featured Decepticon across different media. He was a playable character in the video game War for Cybertron, and even if he never actually came out in either show, really cool and I guess you could say official design concepts of Barricade were made in Transformers Animated and Transformers Prime style, the latter of which actually had a toy released by the Transformers Collectors Club. He even received a nice and more mainline evergreen design based on his look from The Last Knight. Anyway, a few years later, Barricade came full circle when he was finally officially G1ified for 2019's Siege and 2021's Earthrise toy lines. Although his inclusion was probably just Hasbro seeing him as an opportunity for a quick buck. Given his shared origin with the Autobot Prowl, it wasn't much of a surprise that he was basically a repainted and slightly retooled version of the Autobot military strategist, or more specifically, Smokescreen, and added to the growing Datsun Brothers family. And while I get the rationale behind it, I kinda found both versions, especially the Earthrise one, rather uninspired. But oh well, G1 Barricade, yay! Through the years, as robots in disguise, the Transformers have taken on just about every shape, size, and style you can imagine. But even with all that variety, there are some designs that just stick. Some looks that don't just define a character, they define a whole faction. Take the Decepticons for example. Sure, you've got tanks, guns, and Walkmans, but when I think of classic Decepticon, there's one silhouette that stands above the rest. The Seekers, Starscream, Skywarp, Thundercracker. Ruthless warriors with tall jet intake shoulders, wings like cutting blades, and blasters locked onto their arms, ready to rain down chaos from the sky. Fast, cold, unstoppable. That to me is the Decepticon look. But what about the good guys? Of course the Autobots had their answer. The Datsun Brothers, BLUESTREAK, PROWL, and Smokescreen. With their car front chests and little door wings, and most importantly, a toy head sculpt that the actual Autobot logo was based on, these dudes, for me, were the blueprint of what a classic Autobot should look like. Slick, sharp, heroic. Now, while I'd argue that collectively the Datsun Brothers haven't exactly topped the list of iconic Autobots like Prime or that little yellow dude, they've always struck me as some of the most interesting of personalities in the Autobot ranks. Each one is pretty distinctive. BLUESTREAK, traditionally he's the guy who won't stop talking. Endlessly, a total motor mouth. But deep down, it's not just a quirk, it's a coping mechanism, his non-stop chatter. It's a shield, a way to drown out the trauma of watching his home destroyed in the war. And Smokescreen? Oh, Smokescreen, that's the wild card. The gambler, a slick talking specialist in, well, smoke and mirrors. His job wasn't to be the brute force of the battlefield, it was to manipulate, misdirect, and outthink the opposition. A real deceptive type of guy. And I have a soft spot for both of them. BLUESTREAK was actually the first Autobot car toy I ever owned, but when that figure inevitably vanished into the Bermuda Triangle of childhood toys, I was devastated. And later, finding Smokescreen on the shelf felt like getting a second chance on a lost toy, like Primus was smiling down on me. But here's the thing, nostalgia and quirkiness aside, my favorite of the trio today isn't the chatty survivor or the charming trickster. It's the one I never had as a kid. It's Prowl. Not because he's the coolest toy. I mean, police car? Boring. Or I guess the flashiest fighter. I loved Prowl for one reason and one reason alone. Character. As a kid, I loved the fact that Prowl was basically Optimus Prime's right-hand bot. Sure, he and Jazz both filled that second-in-command role, but I don't know, the smooth-talking, music-loving Jazz just felt like the guy the writers wanted you to like. He was cool without even trying. But being the non-conformist that I am, I was never wired to pick the obvious fan favorite. I naturally gravitated towards the other guy, the one who suspiciously sounded like a certain blonde real American hero that was a favorite of mine. A huge shout out to voice actor Michael Bell. Officially, Prowl was Optimus Prime's military strategist and analyst, the one who says if a mission should happen, how it should happen, and whether everyone else's terrible ideas should get shut down immediately. Unofficially, he's the Autobot you can call when the mission absolutely, positively needs to go according to plan. Prowl is calm, loyal, and patient in ways other Autobots aren't, and he's about as predictable as a spreadsheet, which doesn't always make him the life of the party or anyone's favorite hang. Just ask Grimlock. More on that later on. While everyone else is revving up their engines and flexing blasters, Prowl has already broken down the entire battlefield like it was an algebra problem. 800 moving targets? Tracked. Probability of enemy flanking? Accounted for. Expected counter tactics? Already anticipated. Victory? Logically mapped. If there is a problem, he'll solve it. Check out the hook while his logic resolves it. Yeah, this guy is ice, baby. If logic had a physical form, it'd look a lot like Prowl or a certain one-eyed purple Decepticon, but I digress. Like I mentioned earlier, I never actually owned the vintage toy, so my true introduction to Prowl was through the original Transformers cartoon. And yeah, while admittedly he was never the spotlight guy, he didn't stand out for being annoyingly abrasive like Ironhide or entertainingly delusional like Cliffjumper. I would argue that he did have one of the coolest and most memorable fight scenes early on in the series. In the episode Roll For It, Prowl and BLUESTREAK track down Starscream and company to a hangar where they are stripping fighter jets for parts. And mid-fight, Prowl's battle computer is knocked offline from a direct hit to his chest by Soundwave. Crippled, Prowl extends antennae from his head, scans the area looking for an external processor to patch into, and finds the legendary human ally Chip Chase. And just like that, Chip is piloting Prowl like a human-powered Autobot puppet, typing commands and basically turning him into an unstoppable force, dodging laser fire, flipping through the air, and powering up a jet to fire its missiles directly at the cons, literally giving the Seeker jets a taste of their own medicine. Looking back, it feels like a one-off cool moment, a perfect blend of man meets machine. But what's awesome is that idea doesn't stop there. I would say that Chip and Prowl connection, man and bot sharing a body, would turn out to be a cool precursor to future Headmaster tech. And in one continuity, that exact concept plays an integral role in raising Prowl back from the dead. Wait, Prowl? Dead? Yeah, let's talk about Transformers the movie from 1986. It's the year 2005 and Prowl is on a shuttle run to Earth to obtain much-needed energon and supplies from Autobot City for Moonbase 1 as part of a larger assault plan to retake Cybertron. But mid-route, the mission goes sideways. Like history repeating itself, the shuttle is hijacked by the Decepticons, and despite Prowl's maximum effort, he's taken out. Not by Megatron, not by Starscream, but by Scavenger, the Constructicon best known for having a very, very low self-esteem. So, hey, at least he can put one thing on his resume, being the guy who took down one of the most brilliant strategic minds in Autobot history with one shot. Speaking of which, that wasn't just any laser blast. Unlike his previous cartoon injury where Soundwave briefly scrambled Prowl's brain, this one straight up vaporized it, setting off a chain reaction that literally burns Prowl up from the inside, with his eyes and mouth vents burning out fumes. It's one of the most gruesome and traumatic Transformer deaths portrayed in a cartoon. And that wasn't even the end of it. Prowl gets one final shout-out in a post-movie episode, Dark Awakening, where his name is solemnly read off among the fallen Autobots, and his grave is shown housed inside an interstellar Autobot mausoleum, which ultimately ends up plunging into a red sun. Just to really drive the point home, Prowl wasn't just mostly dead, he was dead. Or so you'd think, because apparently Japan didn't get the memo. Thanks to the way release schedules work out, the Transformers movie didn't premiere there until 1989, years after the Japanese exclusive series Headmasters had already begun production. Meaning as far as the Land of the Rising Sun was concerned,
Prowl didn't die, and he pops up alive and well in the Headmaster's show, which sparked another Transformers debate on whether Prowl was dead or alive. Eventually, the Japanese tried to make sense of it all in the fiction attached to a later toy line called Binaltech, and in true Transformers fashion, it involved advanced technology, spark transfers, and a familiar human face from Prowl's past. In this updated continuity, thanks to a time-displaced Ravage, yeah, just go with me on this one. Present-day Wheeljack is warned of his and Prowl's death in a future timeline and rigs him up with a backup system called the Genetronic Translink, basically a tech failsafe to let Prowl remotely control a new body if his original one was ever destroyed. Unfortunately, during a mission near Saturn, Prowl is critically injured and the GT system malfunctions, sending his spark drifting into subspace, lost. And in a surprising twist, Chip Chase, the same human genius who once took remote control of Prowl's body in the cartoon, uploads his own mind into a backup Prowl body. And so, Prowl 2 was born. Same skills, new spark, familiar face. But it didn't end there. Years later, the original Prowl spark is recovered and Chip willingly gives up the Prowl body so that the real Autobot strategist could be restored at last. And just like that, the circle is closed. Prowl was complete again, thanks to tech, multiversal shenanigans, and a very loyal friend with a very old modem. And with that, let's move on from Prowl of the cartoons and see how he fares in another medium, the comics. But don't worry, we'll return to the animated world a little later on. But before that, let's get into Prowl in the original Marvel Comics run, where he doesn't really stray too far from the version we saw in the G1 cartoon. Yeah, I know it's a bit anticlimactic, but Prowl is more often not one at the center of the action. I mean, he's there, just not at the forefront as a major featured player. If anything, he's more of a quiet constant in the background, steady, loyal, and occasionally frustrated whenever someone doesn't follow proper procedure. One of the more memorable Prowl-centric stories comes not from the US run, but from across the pond in the Marvel UK comics, where millions of years before the war, Prowl is introduced as a member of an elite squad called the Magnificent Six, alongside fellow Autobots Jazz, Wheeljack, Sunstreaker, Inferno, and Stampede, on a no-hope mission to take down Decepticon torturer Megadeth. It's a gritty tale of psychological warfare and sacrifice. Megadeth doesn't just fight them, he breaks them, targeting their minds as much as their bodies, and even tortures and kills one of the Autobots in front of the others. I'll give you a guess which one bites the dust, and let's just say his death didn't cause a stampede of angry readers. Anyway, the mission ends in victory, but with a massive emotional fallout, and the trauma of that mission leaves a silent mark on Prowl, another layer to a bot who hides fragility behind logic. Elsewhere in the series, Prowl's authority is constantly challenged by more explosive personalities, most notably the impatient, barely domesticated Grimlock. That clash reaches a boiling point after Optimus Prime's death and Grimlock's rise to Autobot leadership. Prowl defies orders, criticizes Grimlock's recklessness, and generally acts like the tactical buzzkill Grimlock doesn't want, but probably needs. He's basically a constant thorn in Grimlock's side, the type that ends up getting chucked out of the Ark right onto Unicron. Yes, that happened. Beyond that, there really isn't much else to Prowl in the Marvel era. He mostly acted as a foil to the bigger movers and shakers in the series, which is a far cry from what he would become in the more recent IDW Transformers universe, where this time around it was Prowl who was doing a lot of the strategic moving and shaking. And that's when Prowl, the character, really comes alive. The IDW universe is known for digging deep into Transformers lore and rebuilding everything from the ground up, taking third and fourth string characters, classic roster staples, and even brand new faces, then reinventing them into layered, complex personas. IDW throws these bots into sprawling, tightly woven storylines full of intrigue, betrayal, shifting ideologies, and moral chaos. And more often than not, lurking at the center of those naughty plots is Prowl. No longer the two-dimensional by-the-book cop bot, Prowl evolves into something much deeper and at times darker. to the point where you may find yourself wondering, is this guy even an Autobot anymore? But speaking of wondering, if you find yourself wondering what the best way to help my channel out is, the answer is simple. Just keep watching. Yup, while a like, comment, share, or sub are nice and very much appreciated, apparently, the real key to a channel's success on YouTube is extended watch time. So, if you are digging this story, go ahead and watch another, and another, and another. I mean, you could just keep me playing in the background as you go about your day. That would be very much appreciated, as well as any other way you choose to help me out. So, thank you. Now, across IDW's 13-year run, Prowl would become one of the most brilliantly manipulative and morally troubling figures in the entire Transformers mythos. Far from the straight-arrow strategist we knew from G1, this version of Prowl walked the razor's edge between necessary logic and cold-blooded control, earning him as many enemies as allies. In a lot of ways, he evolved right along with his deco, the once clean black and white cop aesthetic slowly blending together into a complicated gray. Fitting for a character who would make every calculated choice feel like another step into moral ambiguity. From the start, Prowl distinguished himself not on the battlefield but behind the scenes, pulling strings, twisting arms, and making decisions nobody else wanted to face. His early career as chief strategist bloomed into full-blown manipulation, psychological leverage over allies, pressure, threats, even blackmail, all in the name of a greater good. Prowl personally arranged for the uber-powerful Decepticon overlord to be secretly installed aboard the exploratory ship Lost Light, home of over 200 crew members led by Rodimus, and coerced Chrome Dome into performing illegal Nemo surgery on him, chalking it up to research for future Autobot survival. And as expected, it didn't end well for several unfortunate crew members. Just ask Pipes. Ouch. But Prowl's cold calculations didn't stop with using Decepticon monsters as science experiments. He turned that same detachment towards his own allies. After growing tired of Autobots listening to reckless heroes while ignoring the more measured wisdom that he offered, Prowl took matters into his own hands, secretly shipping a recently recovered but extremely damaged beloved war veteran Cup to a repair facility to be rebuilt. Not healed, not restored, rewritten. Cup's new body came loaded with personality subroutines designed to make him more compliant, more logical, and, more importantly, a mouthpiece for Prowl's agenda. As Prowl himself coolly put it, when Cup speaks, you won't even see my lips move. That's one more line crossed, turning an ally to a puppet. But the dirt on Prowl goes even deeper as he secretly orders the assassination of Ratbat, carried out by the brutally efficient RC. And when the Insecticon bombshell tampered with his brain, Prowl marched straight into Decepticon territory and executed him on the spot. No trial, no remorse, just a clean shot, justified as self-defense of the mind. The twist? Bombshell had already planted a Cerebro shell, secretly turning Prowl into his pawn and making him do this. Poor Jackie. And ultimately, turning him into the unwilling head of Devastator. For most bots, that'd be a nightmare scenario, but not for Prowl. Once freed, he embraced the role. The Constructicons even preferred combining with him as his ruthless logic gave Devastator a terrifying edge. And when he brought the giant to Earth, there was no subtlety left. He combined, intimidated, and manipulated, wielding Devastator like a sledgehammer, convinced the ends always justified the devastation. But apparently, time spent with the Constructicons gave Prowl a taste for combining. When the Combiner Wars erupted and titans like Superion, Defensor, Devastator, and Menasor clashed, Prowl decided to even the odds in the most Prowl way possible, by forcing it. Using the enigma of combination, he merged himself with Optimus Prime, Ironhide, Mirage, and Sunstreaker, creating the Autobot Combiner, Optimus Maximus. The fusion turned the tide of the battle, but at a cost. It wasn't just their bodies that combined, their minds did too. And what the others saw inside Prowl was enough to shatter any remaining trust. Despite the victory, Prowl's manipulations alienated his allies once and for all. He was arrested soon after. No longer the strategist behind the scenes, but the weapon everybody wanted locked away. And when Optimus tried to reach out to reason with his old friend who once stood beside him with his fist, Prowl only replied that morality had no place in warfare. After so much time as part of Devastator, he admitted he could no longer tell where the Autobots ended and the Decepticons began. The two clashed one final time, with Prime eventually getting the upper hand with his blaster pointed at Prowl's face. But when Prime realized that some fragment of Prowl's consciousness now lived on within him through the Combiner bond, he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger and finish the fight. Eventually, a very specific act from Prowl's past comes back to bite him hard, in the form of a creepy little spider with a habit of crawling into robots' heads and bursting out full-sized. Literally, just ask poor Roadbuster how that turned out. Ugh. But this wasn't just some random horror. This was personal, because before he became the eight-legged lunatic known as Tarantulas, this spider dude was Prowl's secret partner in Autobot Black Ops, the scientist Mesuthelus, who together built unethical tech like the Noise Maze, an extra-dimensional prison, and the Aquitas, a guilt-sensing supercomputer meant to judge wartime crimes. But when Prowl realized how far things had gone, he conveniently had Mesuthelus thrown into the Noise Maze, sealing him away in torment for cycles. And from that torment emerged Tarantulas, a twisted genius hungry for revenge. So Tarantulas kidnaps Prowl, not just to torture him, but to expose him, to drag out every buried war crime into the light. The Wreckers eventually track them down and collapse the Noise Maze and recover Prowl. But make no mistake, this wasn't a heroic rescue, it was damage control. The Wreckers knew that if Prowl's crimes went public, the Autobots could crumble from within, which leads to the unfortunate execution of the Autobot hubcap. A poor dude who knew too much and also had a penchant of talking, and while Prowl didn't do the deed, he thought of it, and almost did, before the Wrecker Impactor beats him to it, bitterly spitting out that there will always be guys like me to pull the trigger when guys like you can't. You're welcome, Prowl. Prowl walks away without charges or a court-martial, but not without consequence. The Wreckers, including former allies like RC and Cup, who now realizes how thoroughly he was used, no longer see a strategist. They see a manipulator who fed his conscience to the grinder and called it logic. It's not legal justice, but something far worse. Prowl survives, but utterly alone. And yet, Prowl pressed on, arming worlds, dodging arrests, and coordinating defenses to counter the impending threat of Unicron. He gets himself a ship, the Peaceful Revolution, and a new crew composed of Throttlebot survivors Chase, Rollbar, and Goldbug, who in this universe is not Bumblebee, and the Jangle Man himself, Wheelie. Stardrive, the last living space knight of the Soul Star Order, and a big dumb lug named Garnak. Yeah, not the most groundbreaking team, but whatever. When Unicron finally arrives, Prowl joins the fight. Ever the strategist, he operates with the same cold precision that had defined his life, weaponizing forbidden tech and planning every move like the war had never ended. But by then, it wasn't about forgiveness. It was habit. Control was all he knew, and when Optimus Prime sacrificed himself to destroy Unicron, something in Prowl broke. The man with the plan finally stopped. After the war, he handed Megatron over for trial and later visited a broken Shockwave, admitting, perhaps to both of them, that people are defined not by what they believe, but what they do. Prowl survived, but when the dust settled, the question remained. What happens when the sharpest mind in the room realizes there's no one left who trusts him? Autobot hero? Fallen strategist? Moral monster? In IDW, Prowl was all of them. He wasn't just caught in the gray. He was the gray. Not gonna lie, that version of Prowl got dark. And while that's fascinating in its own right, I can't exactly end on a note that heavy. So how about we lighten things up a bit? Let's shift into something more positive and definitely more heroic. enter Transformers Animated Prowl. Now, yes, before someone in the comments comes for me, technically this is a completely different character who just happens to share the name. But as a massive fan of Transformers Animated, there's no way I'm leaving this guy out. I mean, what's better than a sleek police-themed Autobot? How about a police-themed Autobot who's also a cyber ninja? In the world of Transformers Animated, a universe loosely hinted to be a far-flung continuation of the G1 cartoon, Prowl is a different kind of dude. Aside from sharing a name and being police-themed, he barely resembles his G1 predecessor. He trades his police car alt mode for a police motorcycle, and his battlefield tactics for martial arts serenity. Less military strategist and more cyber ninja sage. At the start, Prowl is everything you'd expect from a loner warrior. Aloof, highly observant, and borderline dismissive of teamwork. He values silence, precision, and a deep sense of balance. Teamwork? Not his thing, especially when the team includes grumps like Ratchet, loud and chaotic bots like Bulkhead, or pesky little dudes like Bumblebee. Stranded on Earth, Prowl slowly learns to reconnect with nature, his teammates, and himself. And in the end, that quiet spiritual warrior becomes the soul of the team. A soul that in the end he willingly gives up. In the finale of Transformers Animated, Megatron unleashes massive Omega Supreme clones armed with city-destroying bombs. The only way to stop them? Reforge the shattered Allspark into a protective energy field. Prowl, alongside Jazz, manages to gather its fragments, but the field needs one final spark to activate, and without hesitation, Prowl gives his own. By merging his life force with the Allspark, Prowl completes the shield, containing the blast and saving the day. He dies in the process, turning his long journey from lone warrior to selfless protector into one final act of pure heroism. While Animated Prowl may not have been the original, I've always seen him as a true spiritual successor to the classic character. And speaking of spiritual successors, Prowl's name actually lived on into the Beast War era, where two very different Maximals carried the legacy forward. The first, Prowl the Lion, was part of the Combiner Team Magnaboss alongside fellow veterans Ironhide and Silverbolt. Said to be the same G1 Prowl reborn in a new Maximal body after the Great War. The second Prowl, Prowl the Owl, had a far stranger origin. This one was said to be the evolved form of Prowl 2 from the Binaltech story, the experimental hybrid created when Chip Chase uploaded his consciousness into a Prowl body. In a way, Beast War didn't just carry on his name, it split his legacy in two, one tracing the survival of the strategist, and the other preserving his bond with humanity. Now, all that being said, for all his longevity across eras, there was one version of Transformers where Prowl never got his moment in the spotlight. The live-action Bayverse. Now, to be fair, Prowl did get a shot, at least in the early planning stages of the 2007 Michael Bay film. He was reportedly on the short list of Autobots being considered to be featured. But in the end, Bay decided that instead of giving us a good cop to serve and protect, it'd be way cooler to go all in on a bad cop who punishes and enslaves. And just like that, Prowl was out and the Decepticon Barricade was in. Now look, I've got nothing against Barricade. He's earned his own place in the lore. And yes, I've covered him in a whole other video, link in the description below. But I secretly held on to the hope through several sequels that maybe, just maybe, Barricade would pull a twist and reveal himself to be an undercover Prowl. It never happened, and aside from a few cameos in tie-in comics which don't really count in my book, Prowl basically never made it into the Bayverse. And honestly, looking at what Michael Bay did to most of our beloved G1 characters not named Bumblebee, that might have been the greatest strategic win of Prowl's entire career. Because, let's face it, any real strategist would know that a character's success in the Transformers universe isn't just about dazzling with big screen CGI and explosions. No, it's about something far more tactical, or actually, tactile. Like, exactly how many toys of said character we can get our grubby little hands on. And by that metric, I believe that Prowl did pretty
pretty good.
After the OG toy released in 1984 gradually faded from retail shelves in the following years, prompting his unfortunate death in the 1986 movie, the next version of Prowl would be released in 1990 in the form of a rather unspectacular, non-transforming action master. But hey, at least he came with a turbocycle that transformed from motorcycle to a gun emplacement. The 90s saw Beast Wars Prowl come to life in plastic, with Prowl the Lion being released in 1997 alongside his Mag the Boss forming buddies Ironhide and Silverbolt in a special Ultra Class 3-pack. And then Prowl the Owl being released in 2 color decos in 1999. Then in 2003, the aforementioned Japanese Binaltech line, featuring mostly G1 Autobots reimagined as modern cars, was launched, with their first release being the diversionary tactician Smokescreen. While not the most popular Autobot out there, Smokescreen as first choice made sense given despite his new alt mode as a Subaru Impreza, he was traditionally a Datsun brother, which meant he had 2 brothers who could also be released using the same mold at minimal cost. And so it wasn't a surprise that a year later we got Silver Streak, and then in 2005 we got Prowl, who curiously wasn't a repaint at all. He was a brand new design that transformed from an Acura RSX into a robot mode that sorta looked like Red Alert, because apparently that was the original plan. Either way, this specific Prowl toy, okay, actually, if you want to be technical about it, the US Alternators version of it has a great significance to me, as this, along with Alternator Sunstreaker, were the first 2 Transformer toys that I got as an adult that eventually birthed my second life as a toy collector. Yup, the ones that pushed me into that money-sucking rabbit hole that I am still sinking deeper and deeper into to this day. Oh, and this Prowl was also the very first toy that I modded, switching his legs around to give him a more Prowl-ish looking robot mode. 3 years later in 2008, we got Universe Prowl, who was sort of officially the first modern iteration of the G1 character. Remember kiddies, Binaltech Prowl was supposed to be Prowl 2. That same year, we also saw the release of Titanium Series Prowl, which was based on an awesome Cybertronian mode design of the ultra-talented Filipino artist Don Figueroa. Unfortunately, despite the amazing design it was based on, this one was pretty much a clunker. I mean, could his upper half be any wider? Yikes. Anyway, aside from a series of other random releases of G1 Prowl like a simplistic Legends class, Bot Shots, Creo, and so on, the animated version of Prowl also arrived in toy shelves in 2008. A perfect translation of the hyper-stylized aesthetic of the show into plastic, complete with his signature throwing stars that stored neatly in his motorcycle wheels. And just when you thought that they couldn't top that, a year later, a retooled version was released with a motorcycle sidecar that could convert into armor bits and weaponry that turned this cyber ninja into a cyber samurai. And while Prowl never made an appearance in the series that followed animated Transformers Prime, Smokescreen did, and thanks to him traditionally sharing a mold with his Datsun brother, Prowl got included in the toy line as well in 2013, which was cool. But the bigger news that year was that Prowl finally hit the big time with his first official masterpiece Transformers toy, which basically hit all the right design beats for a faithful masterpiece rendition of the OG toy and character. Like, as of now, this is the only decent Prowl for any masterpiece display, although his days are possibly numbered. We'll get to that in a bit. But first, back to the main retail line, where in 2015, Prowl made a return in the Combiner Wars line as a lazy repaint/retool of the Stunticon Dead End. Fortunately, Hasbro made up for that rather uninspired attempt by finally giving us a couple pretty back-to-basic versions of Prowl a few years later. First up, a grimy Cybertronian version in 2019's Siege line, and then a more traditional Earth mode version the next year for, well, Earthrise, which, if you want to talk really faithful to the original toy, also had a rather brittle windshield that was prone to breakage, and which Hasbro humorously, or is that morbidly, retooled in 2023 as Dead Prowl, thankfully sans the death fumes spewing from his face, and sold it in a 2-pack with an equally shot-up Ironhide, also thankfully before Megatron blew off his head, as part of the buzzworthy Bumblebee line. And just for kicks, for Hasbro's Legacy line, a G1ified version of animated Prowl was also released that year as well. And finally, what would any decent toy rundown be without some unofficial third-party offerings? Like I said, while it did take quite a while, the official masterpiece Prowl eventually did start to show a little bit of age, especially for collectors looking for a more cartoon aesthetic. And so, sensing a growing need, third-party company DX9 released prototype shots of their take on a more toon-accurate Prowl named Devetive in 2024, which, as of this writing, is on the verge of being released, with final production shots being posted literally just a few weeks ago. And I have to say, this guy looks almost perfect if it weren't for those damn holes in his legs. Like, really? I know us collectors have been accused of being overly finicky, but I don't know, this just ruins the look for me. Of course, not to be outdone, and as always playing the role of third-party bully, hoping to steal some thunder from DX9 is, well, Fans Toys, under the guise of Fantastic Model, who, right on cue, showed off renders of their planned masterpiece Toon Prowl on the eve of Devitive's release. But you know what? Is it just me, or does it not look that great either? Oh well, only time will tell, but at least for me, it doesn't look quite clear-cut that Takara's official masterpiece Prowl's days on my shelf are numbered.